This is Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. Every organization is driven by data, but how can you turn it into powerful storytelling? By asking the right questions, discovering the insights, and building your data story. This is the podcast that talks to leaders and thinkers around the world about how they use data smarter, so you can too. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Hello, I'm your host, Sam Knowles. Well, it's been 3 months since we published the first episode of Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. In that short time, we've built a loyal following with hundreds of regular subscribers and thousands of listens and downloads from Apple, Spotify and Google Podcasts and from our YouTube channel at Data Malarkey. Before we started, we decided that each season of Data Malarkey would constitute 6 episodes of interviews, with leading thinkers and practitioners in data storytelling taken from very different worlds. In Season 1, we've had 2 academics, the former head of the UK Space Agency, 2 marketing gurus, one client-side, the other agency, and a coach and author striving to bring balance to the world of social and digital media. After each season, it's my honour and privilege to go back through the previous 6 episodes, released every other Wednesday over a 3-month period, and choose my favourite snippets. Some I'm going to choose because they bring entertainment, fresh insight and understanding. Others will be in a cluster, common thoughts or perspectives from people doing radically different jobs, but aligning the planets and joining the dots. And others still will earn their spurs because they're priceless gems. Bits of audio and video that have made me smile, laugh, or go slack-jawed in amazement. The first theme in this Best of Data Malarkey Season 1 podcast concerns balance. The first question I ask my guests is a question designed to get to the heart of who they are, beyond the day job. I ask them, how do you spend your time? Here's what we heard in turn from author Anastasia Dedyukina, DoubleVerify's Laetitia Zinetti, and Quadriga University professor Anna Addy.
I spend my time trying to find a balance, which means that I do spend quite a bit of time outdoors. So walking in nature, being part of the nature garden, it is something that has to happen on a daily basis. I spend my time looking for new ideas and sharing new ideas, and this can come in any form, whether I'm teaching, whether I'm writing, whether I'm speaking. I spend quite a bit of time moving. Dancing is my biggest thing, but also it can be walking, it can be playing volleyball, basically any type of movement, preferably outdoors. And just kind of digging deep into myself, all those ways to try to be a better version of who I am.
Very good. I'm taken by the being outdoors. I in a book I wrote a few years ago all about insight, called How to Be Insightful. I interviewed the Oxford neuroscientist, Professor Susan Greenfield, and she introduced me to a really interesting school of psychology called environmental psychology, which demonstrates that if we're somewhere big, not somewhere desky, surrounded by people and phones and the rest of it, but if we're somewhere big, time effectively slows down because we're able to process more information. So she advocates being in mountains rather than hills, oceans rather than lakes, deserts rather than beaches. But I really, really absolutely endorse your getting outside. But Laetitia, first of all, I'd like to know, how do you spend your time?
I think I would describe myself as a multitasking woman. I'm trying to juggle work, relationship, kids, and everything in between within the finite time and resources. So it's kind of why you will always find on my desk some kind of to-do list, where I would list all the tasks I need to perform, both professionally and personally, ranked by importance and urgency. But also on this list, you will always find some kind of blank box, where I can write down some ideas that are coming up during the day or during the night, not really, but more during the day. And so that I just don't forget them and I can go back to them when I feel like it. And I think it's about potentially, balancing rigor and creativity, ensuring I do what I need to do, but not kind of, leaving me enough time to also think a little bit outside the box.
I love the idea of the blank box. In work that I do in training in insight and insightful thinking, I encourage people to have means of recording what thoughts may come to them at the strangest times. If I had shares in a company that sells crayons for the shower, as well as kind of post-it notes and pens, I think I could do well. My first question for you, Anna, is how do you spend your time?
Oh, I thought of that quite a bit. It is a tough question. I can see why. But the mesmerist, tries to really get to the heart of you. I think at the core of a lot of the things that I do throughout the day, has to do with finding balance and reflecting on the mark that we leave for posterity. And so that informs, in a sense, my research and the reading that I do. That means that no course that I teach is the same as the last. That also means that I constantly question myself, and I think my poor students need to go through my anxieties, in a sense. Like, is this relevant? Is this just my view? Is my experience tempering or influencing and informing this so heavily? So that's the reflecting and the thinking part of things. I also try to find balance, and by doing that, of course, there's the engagement with others, the conversations that I have, but I also paint. I've started painting that as an effort to find balance, and I tend to paint with colors that do not listen to control. So I do. I like to play with alcohol inks, or I like to play with inks on watercolor paper where you have loads of water and these inks do whatever they want to do. So yes, very much about me learning to relinquish control and learning how to cope with that. And one more other thing that I do is, again, in terms of learning and breaking boundaries and coping with these boundaries, shifting boundaries, is that ever since the pandemic, I've started to learn to play piano. And I knew a couple of languages before, so I've been through the frustration of learning, but never with an instrument. And I find that exhilarating. That does bring me joy and balance, as painting and as all this reflecting that I do for work.
As you've heard, bringing balance to our world of data overload is often best done completely removed from digital devices. Outside, moving and leaving time and space for opportunity and insights to arise. Having burnt herself out through an addiction to digital devices, Anastasia today makes her living writing and speaking, coaching and mentoring individuals, teams and companies on the practical steps they can take to avoid becoming addicted to these devices and to become consciously digital. She told us what her personal rules for life are. Lots that she does and advises that we would all do well to follow.
I think there are generally the rules for myself that I need to prioritize activities that give me energy. These activities mainly tend to be outside of my devices. And these activities tend to be related or to movement, to being in nature, or I also do theater improvisation. So which leaves not so much time for digital activities. But it's not because I'm consciously eliminating them, it's more because I'm prioritizing other things. And this is, by the way, often the tip that I give to parents who are asking, how do I get my kids unplugged? And I would say this should not be the goal in itself. Yeah, the goal is how do you get your kids, interested and prioritize what's really important. Then they have less time, less energy to do other things. Now, of course, this becomes more difficult as we're being more cold and kind of seduced into this virtual thing, and when more and more things are happening online. Here, we're told that the future is augmented reality and virtual reality. We will see that. So far, it's data doesn't prove that. But I think for myself, just the couple of very simple rules. No devices when I'm eating. Taking a break when I feel that I'm starting to procrastinate digitally and my focus is going down, and it's inevitable. And that I discovered, I have to be very honest with myself, and it might go down, after an hour and a half. And I feel, oh my God, I need to do so much more. But I know if I don't stop now, then I will just end up, the news websites all the time. So just being honest with what my body is asking me, and no devices allowed in the bedroom. So that's probably the toughest rules. I also don't have any social media on my phone. So I do have now a regular smartphone. And probably, but that's a different thing. I don't think that I need to upgrade my phone every year. So that's for actually environmental reasons. And I resist it. Endless marketing attempts to try to make me do that every 12 months. But that's nothing more rigid than that.
What are the most important beliefs in your consultancy business?
I think for us, the most important thing to understand is that technology is a tool, and as a tool, it can help, but it will only be a tool as long as we are managing it, and it's not managing us. And in order to be able to have full control over it, we need transparency. We need to understand how decisions have been taken, going back to the data, how the data is being collected. Is it biased data? And, a very classic example is now lots of recruitment websites and recruitment agencies are using historical data to train algorithms, because no recruiter now is going over CVs manually. It just consumes lots of time. Now we think that we're always short of time, so we need to save it any second. We're willing to pay for that. So what happens for us is that if we feed into this AI system existing data, and if this data is biased, it's going to replicate human bias. There has been an interesting study that was done recently at the University of Melbourne, where they basically compared the results of candidate selection from a committee of 40 humans and from the AI. So they presented the same resume with the only difference that the resume had female names and other resume identical had male names. And it was done in collaboration with the banks of finance industry. Humans, surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, I should say, preferred male candidates to women, with everything being equal, just based on the names. So one would hope, hey, AI would behave differently, right? It's like we are introducing AI because it's supposed to help us challenge our human bias. Guess what? AI was trained on the previous historical data. So actually, even after a number of iterations, AI was still selecting male candidates just because that's how it was trained. So I think it's absolutely essential for companies, for recruiters, but also for candidates to understand how decisions have been taken about them. In Europe, for instance, you have the right to appeal, according to GDPR, about an algorithmic decision that has been taken about you. But so far, what we see is that this very much remains unknown to the general public. And it really doesn't have to be that difficult. It's something that we need to be talking about on a daily basis. There are these cases of discrimination everywhere. If you look at it, when the decision, and more decisions have been taken about us automatically. So this is what training digital literacy is about. It's not about knowing how to press a button. It's not knowing about how, to swipe Tinder. But it's knowing about, when you're registering on Tinder, how this data is going to be used, who is going to be shared with, and different privacy reports show that Tinder has been showing and sharing the data with over than 3,000 different partners that later aggregate this data. They can advertise to you, then can find people who are vulnerable, for instance. So understanding what happens with your data, how your data is being used to take decisions about you, and how people can impact you. I'm not even talking about the big tech, all seen this, but on a daily basis, how, for instance, your employer may view the data, what sort of data they have about you, and if they are not trained in using the data, what this may mean for you. A classic and a very disturbing example happened, I think, about 3 years ago, when Microsoft launched its so-called productivity score. Now, there was a big scandal, and they backed off and said, no, we're just doing it as an experiment. But initially what they tried to do, they basically tried to calculate how productive you're being when you are using Microsoft apps, so like whether it's email, whether it's Outlook, whether it's Excel. And then this score would be shown to your manager. And what they were saying is, manager, if you want us to compare this score to the score of people who work in this area, share it with us so we will tell you how your employees are performing. What do you think are the consequences of that? Or what are possible consequences of that? Now, somebody who sits in Silicon Valley, I don't know who exactly was working on that, but that would be a safe assumption to make, is creating an absolutely arbitrary number of rules, that defines that I am productive. So look, I'm a writer, I'm maybe I do digital marketing once in a while. How do they know what drives my productivity? Is putting out, like a certain number of symbols per minute is what it is, but I'm not a typist, right? Who and how assesses my productivity? Could it be helpful to measure that? Yeah, probably yes, but I would like as a person to know the criteria. I would like as a person to be able to change this criteria so that it fits to my job. And by all means, I would like also to have some control over who it's been shared. And when I say that, the way we use the data is we need to really, really be careful with how we're doing it, how we're collecting, how we're sharing. This is what I mean, like every single thing that we share can be collected and can be used in a way against us. And I think going back to your original question about the manifesto, what we really would like to do is really to empower people to make informed choices. That's why the company and the network is called Consciously Digital. It's not going back to the caves. I think we're being given a very false choice of, let's give up all technology or let's go ahead with the progress as we're describing it. No, the progress is, when I decide myself as a citizen, I know what's happening, and if the economy is going digital, I should also be able to know what my digital rights are and exercise them. And we don't see this happening anywhere still. We're working on it.
Katherine Courtney, former head of the UK Space Agency, proved herself to be an eloquent data storyteller when relating how she gets primary school children to appreciate why we simply cannot be alone in the universe. And in a separate clip, quite how crowded space really is today.
So I do talks to schools. I do talks about space junk. I do talks to, primary school children to say, you guys are going to have to solve the problem that the grown-ups have caused, right? So, and one of the things that I talk about, a story I tell to try and get people interested in space, just as a topic, is to ask this question of, do you think we're alone? Now, the numbers in space are massive, huge numbers, and I can't retain it in my head, so I write them down. And so I say, this is what scientists estimate, right? There are about 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. An average of 100 billion stars in each galaxy means that there are about 200 billion trillion stars. And that is a 2 followed by 21 zeros. And when you write that number on a slide or a blackboard, and you just go 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, the kids just think, that is a lot. That's just huge, massive, huge. So If that's how many stars there are, and scientists estimate that every fifth star, 20% of those, has at least one planet orbiting in it in something called the Goldilocks zone. Scientists actually use this terminology. The Goldilocks zone, as you might imagine, is not too close to their sun to be too hot to support life and not too far away to be too cold. Earth is in the Goldilocks zone of our star. And the question, this actually, Fermi was an astronomer who asked this question many, many centuries ago. The paradox, the Fermi paradox, if there are that many suns like our suns out there, and that many potentially Earth-like planets out there, in the billions of trillions we're talking about, where is everybody? So it's not really a question of when we are discovered by other forms of intelligent life or we discover them. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It's a question of when. And if you put all those zeros down, the kids can kind of, both relate to, oh, I might not be the only kid on this planet and the only planet with life on it in this universe. So, but it's a really, really big space. So, I think if you use some eye-catching numbers to make your point, then you can, it's a memorable thing. They might go home that night and write down that number for their parents and say, this is how many stars there are. And at least 1 in every 5 of those could have an Earth-like planet orbiting around it. I do think if we don't get a grip on space traffic management up there, how we share the space in space, we could any day face a scenario where there's a large enough collision of unmanageable objects in the wrong place moving too quickly that would cause a chain reaction that could take all of the satellite infrastructure out. And that will turn our lives back to the way we lived them in the 1950s.
Wow.
The internet, stock exchanges, ATM machines, ambulances, your food delivery during lockdown, you name it. It all depends on satellite data for your everyday life, and if we allow that situation to happen, we will have sleepwalked ourselves into a disaster that will take 200 years to naturally clean itself up. Generations.
Quadriga University's Anna Addy gave a delightful echo of what Katherine was saying about space junk when she talked about digital detritus that we all leave all over the internet.
And digital forensic is fantastic because it can be related to crime finding and crime spotting. And it's still very much about finding clues, finding traces, finding what people leave behind. And so if you think about what I've told you before, that I like to reflect about where we come from, where we go, and what we leave, the digital space to me is almost like a new world. But we also are very careless and not very considerate, in my view, in the way we think and we clean up our internet. There's a lot of debris out there. There's a lot of junk. There's a lot of information, like it's lost in space, and this we leave with the internet. So I'm curious as well. What is it that we leave behind? What is it that we forget on purpose and we leave there? What is it that we forget because we really lost track of all the platforms that have come up and all the fads and all the buzzes and everything? And that goes into the spirit of digital humanism and keeps you into this area of humanities, of social science. But it looks also into this new world.
I think that's brilliant. I have a sister who is a absolutely stellar forensic scientist. She's kind of, her career is almost done, and she's has a track record of solving some of the hardest cold cases to solve. And she always quotes the grandfather of modern forensic science, the French Edmond Locard, who says, every contact leaves a trace. And I love the thought. I think when we were talking in preparation, I might have referenced that when my son, who's now 19 at university himself, was born, I created a website that had early pictures. And I can't remember, it probably lasted about a year and a half. But presumably there is some kind of trace out there. Maybe he or some. But I love that idea of the waste and like and the junk, and then, but also with legislation to the right to be forgotten and so on and so forth. So I think that's your digital humanism is a very distinctive phrase, but you unpack it beautifully. Being able to explain complex research and data that underpins it simply and straightforwardly, particularly to those who have little or no experience or understanding of science, takes real skill. Professor Rusi Jaspal, psychology professor at the University of Brighton, told us all about a spectacular initiative called the Brains at the Bevy. Brighton academics present their research in a community-owned pub, the Bevendine, which is located in the university's home of Molescombe, on the outskirts of Brighton. Let Rusi explain. I heard you speak at an event recently, and you were talking about the presentation of research done at the University of Brighton. Am I right in thinking in a pub in the local community in which your university sits? Could you tell us a bit more about that? Because it doesn't sound like the most immediate way in which one would disseminate academic research.
Yeah, sure. So, Sam, we've introduced the Brains at the Bevy initiative, which is held at a community pub in Bevendine. And the purpose of that initiative is to communicate the findings of research that's conducted at the University of Brighton. We decided to introduce that because, on the one hand, our research is applied. It's all about making a difference to people's lives. That's what motivates the researchers at the university. But it seemed rather problematic that only academics should be able to benefit from those findings and should be exposed to those findings. Because actually we know that when you publish in academic journals, or if you publish academic monographs and books, those outputs are intended for a very specific academic audience. We really wanted the local community to get involved in research for the following reasons. First of all, to see the value of research as a phenomenon. All of the great innovations that we take for granted these days have emerged in one way or another on the basis of research findings. So it seemed really important that we make people aware of the great benefits of research, and why that's a very good use also of funding in a funding constrained environment that we operate within. The second reason we wanted to introduce this was because we really wanted the local community to feel empowered to help shape our research, to tell us what we need to be researching, to engage in a two-way dialogue, so that we're not just developing research questions that we think are important, but rather the local community also are playing an important role in that process. And the third reason is also to inspire people around the value of research and higher education more generally, because research is fascinating. And I know you're probably thinking, Sam, of course Rusi Jaspal would say that as Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research and Knowledge State, and you're quite right, I have a stake. But actually, way before I became the Pro-Vice Chancellor, I was so passionate about research, its value, and asking questions and being able to find the answers, often in collaboration with people who are much more intelligent than I am, for sure, and who are much more skilled with research methods than I am.
I think it sounds like a fantastic initiative, and I mean, presumably because it's based in the local community, the majority of the people that are in the bevy to listen to that are people who are not involved in the university at all, apart from the fact they just happen to live nearby.
Absolutely, that's right. And actually, I had the great privilege of speaking to some of the attendees after one of the events, and several reported never having attended an event like that before, and actually feeling that they wouldn't understand what was going on, and they'd feel quite out of place at a research event. And I think the key is really to try and present your research effectively. And it's a point I made right at the beginning of our conversation. You've got to present your work in a way that's going to be intelligible to particular groups, and also that's going to resonate with them. And actually at the Brains at the Bevy series, that's precisely what the main task of the presenter is. It's to present the research in a non-academic way, rather in a way that's geared towards public communication, public engagement.
Rusi also told us about the responsibility that scientists, in his case psychologists, face in making sure their data is clean, honest and true, because the outcomes of his colleagues and his peers' work has the genuine opportunity to affect real change in social policy. Can you talk about a little bit some of the challenges that you face in making sure that the data you and your teams collect is useful for and usable for you? I mean, ensuring it's clean, ensuring it's intact, ensuring it can actually be used to test the hypotheses that you want to test.
Yes, Sam, I must say these questions keep me up at night, and I'll tell you why. As a psychologist and as a fellow of the British Psychological Society, I'm aware of the power that psychologists and many other social scientists possess in terms of affecting change in society. Often policymakers will rely upon the findings that we generate in our research. Therefore, it makes the responsibility an enormous one. The responsibility to get it right is a significant one. That's why I said that it keeps me up at night, because actually there is much scope, as we already discussed, for error when we're developing our research questions, when we're designing a study, and when we collect our data and when we analyze those data. But to address your question more directly, I try to triangulate my findings. So I will, of course, use measures to try and measure really complex constructs like self-esteem and self-efficacy and things like that have already been validated in other research where possible. But I will try and also triangulate the findings using other methods. And that was the point that I was making a moment ago. So if you can also collect data using a different sample, preferably in a different cultural context, that's very good. But also if you can collect some qualitative data, that can help you also to ensure that you're actually measuring what you think you're measuring. Because I'm also really mindful of something, Sam, and that is that your results, what you get out of your statistical analysis package, is as good as what you put into the research. So it depends on the instruments that you've used to collect your data. And you need to be very transparent about those instruments when you report your research findings. You need to tell your reader how it is that you've measured self-esteem. Is it just using a single item, a single question, or is it actually tapping into different dimensions of self-esteem with a multitude of questions? That's really important. You need to also be able to report things like the reliability scores, how correlated your items are with one another. So all of these things are really important. But thankfully, I think a responsible researcher, and my colleagues most certainly are, will have a checklist that they'll go through to ensure that they are doing everything that's humanly possible, that we're using every technique that we're aware of as researchers to ensure that we are collecting robust data, and then that we're analyzing those data as we should be and effectively. And I think it's problematic because of something I said earlier on in our conversation, and that is because we as researchers enjoy a great deal of power in shaping the way in which those findings will be used by influential people like policymakers. And if you claim causality on the basis of data that do not actually allow you to infer causality, that can have really big implications. And it's easy to see how in the area of public health, for instance, it could have really, really significant implications. So I think it's very important that we recognize, again, the limitations of our data. And by the way, what I'm saying is not to suggest that cross-sectional data are useless. They are very useful, but we've just got to be clear. So I think it comes back to your fundamental interest, actually, Sam, and that's narrative. It's how you're presenting your findings. It's the story you're telling, and you've got to be so honest in that story, and you've got to just focus upon what your data can plausibly and legitimately tell you based upon the design.
Anna Addy from Quadriga built on this and emphasized the importance of putting data in context, humanizing it, telling real human stories, but stories rich in emotion. Thinking about kind of effective communication and you're doing this research in order to tell a story about, what's changed, what's different, and so on. What do you think is the best way to combine narrative and numbers, stories, statistics? What do you think is the best way of doing that?
I'm not sure if it's best, but it works. So when having numbers, one of the things that I tell my students, and one of the things that I also try to do is put them in context. Humanize them, if you want. Find out an experience that people can relate to when they read that story. A couple of years ago, I remember reading, and I still have it. It's on my bookshelf. Is Dan and Heath's book, Made to Stick.
Yep.
And I think those are wonderful. This easy method of theirs that they described is absolutely fantastic, because they speak about analogies, they speak about finding the common elements, they speak about metaphors and epithets of translating basically big numbers that I have no idea of into proxy. But one of the things that I also love about it is making it simple. Thinking of who the authority is, which of course for corporate comms and PR is empowering, right? Because if you can tell communicators that it's not always your boss that needs to speak, but rather considering who's relevant in this case, it is empowering. What I also do like about it is how much they stress the importance of emotion. Numbers do not have emotion. They're dehumanizing if you want. But that they can reflect emotion if we put them into stories, if we link them to the human experience. And I think we need to do that. To you and I, it's not going to mean anything if we say that 58% of communicators feel that communications practice needs to have a social impact. But if you say that many communicators have found themselves in these recent times pondering about the legacy that they leave, realizing that pursuing values-based campaigns have divided us as much as have united us. And we talk about, the Pepsi campaign or the whatever campaign that we know of, probably will be in a better place. Then that number is going to help us understand there are a lot of us. We can also go about differently about that number. It can be more than every second communicator. Different ways in putting numbers, but numbers on their own are just abstract.
We'll end this first roundup of the first season of Data Malarkey with two of my favourite sections from my interview with Mark Evans, the former Chief Marketing Officer of Direct Line Group. The first is Sublime, where Mark talks all about the value of bringing genuinely diverse, neurodiverse workforces together, particularly if you're looking to make smarter use of data. His prescription fills me with optimism for a world of work in which everyone has the opportunity to fulfill their potential, whatever their degree or flavour of neurodiversity. You've talked about this historically, and I know it's a passion area for you. I'm interested in neurodiverse workforces, and I know that that's something that you champion. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, and maybe data in the context of championing neurodiverse workforces?
Yeah, my belief is that the role of the marketer, and I suppose any marketing leader, and I suppose any leader, is to create whole brain teams. Particularly in marketing, it obviously is a discipline. It spans from extreme left brain, all the marketing effectiveness, econometrics, all the way through to extreme right brain, whether that's insourced or not, in terms of the creative output and content. And there's this mythical unicorn, which is that person that can do the full spectrum from left brain to right brain. Now, maybe some can, but in the main, people have an epicenter, a point of focus. And so the challenge is to create whole brain teams. And this, for me, is the very essence of diversity. It is diversity of thought. Now, of course, I'm the first to say that diversity has a huge social justice and inclusion aspect. I chaired the DEI committee at Direct Line. But I think the bit that gets forgotten is the ... and the implicit benefit is diversity of thought. Now, if you hold that, then, of course, neurodiversity is talking to the fact that people's brains are wired fundamentally differently, and that potentially more than any previous life experience or orientation on any paradigm is more valuable because it's wired into people's brains. The diversity of thought comes at source in the chemistry and function and structures of an individual's brain. And so my journey started, my daughter was 8 years old, so 12 years ago, diagnosed with dyslexia. And just with everything in my life, just got really curious. In the end, started campaigning both internally and externally, helped set up with Lou Calvert, the direct line, the neurodiversity strand within the DEI agenda. And I just came to realize that this was the missing trick. It's the silent and invisible aspects of diversity that are typically underrepresented. And one aspect of that, of course, is brilliance of some individuals, many individuals with neurodiversity as relates to data. And so actually we worked with a company called Auticon, who you could argue weren't the most inclusive of organizations in that they only helped to recruit and place people with autism. You could forgive them for that, I guess. But that was a fascinating experience because they didn't use any interviews or CVs. It was skills testing, task matching to capability. And I remember one specific instance where there was a very, very, very technical piece of analytics required in one team that had over 100 years of experience, and they really hadn't made the breakthrough. And so we approached Auticon, and they placed somebody who turned out to be brilliant, who fixed the problems with a cherry on top of the icing, on top of the cake, in record time. And it was a very different work context in terms of the way they were working together. But that individual was amazing in terms of unlocking a really big problem for us. And so I just think there's sort of that. And then I overlay that, for example, take autism. I think there's only 8% employment, and generally neurodiversity over-indexes with people being homeless, in prison, mental health issues, as well as unemployment. And so for me, this is, if what gets my goat is people don't get a chance to fulfill their potential, then this is a really big one, because there's companies who've got some really knotty problems, not least data problems, and there's some data geniuses out there, and somehow the market doesn't match up very well, and there isn't an established platform for this. So it's something that I'll continue to push as an agenda, because it's a tragedy that this happens.
And finally, as the Data Malarkey office cat Quincy has made more than one unscheduled appearance in season 1, here's Mark Evans' data confession of the time he was a cat food marketer at Mars. What's the worst example of a misuse of data that you've observed, either in the public domain or maybe in your own career? But what do you think is the worst example that you've seen in recent years?
Well, it does go back a little time, but it was a personal howler, which I'm now sort of at ease to talk about. I don't think there's sort of any reputational damage that can happen, but we'll see. Now, I went through the graduate scheme at Mars, had a fantastic time. I worked in sales and manufacturing, and then moved to Greece to work in confectionery advertising for a period of time. Then I came back to the UK and did pretty well. And I got to a place where I was, we were looking at the rollout of cat pouches, pouched food in the cat category. It was a runaway train. It was going brilliantly well in these little 100-gram sachets, which triggered all the right category benefits and proof points: cleanliness, freshness, variety, etc. And so we were thinking, how can we go even further and faster? And so I led a project which was looking at 200-gram pouches, and the data was so obvious. I mean, half of cats live in multi-cat households. And wouldn't it be so easy to just open one rather than two for your 2 cats? And so we did a massive simulated test market, the where you build the shelves, and we did that in France, UK and Germany, and cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. This was going to be, from 5x or whatever it was, the whole thing. Absolute disaster. Absolute disaster. But why? So obvious. I mean, multi-cat households, 200-gram pouches, surely. But no, and the whole project was killed. I thought that I wanted the ground to swallow me up. I thought I was going to get fired. Actually, I had an amazing boss who said, well, that's brilliant. We've learned. That's okay. But the thing we overlooked was that all those benefits in terms of ease and freshness and particularly variety was more powerful at a single cat level. So Tiddles likes beef and Toddles likes lamb. So when people came to the simulator, I can see your cat's tail as we...
Right on cue.
Right on cue.
There we go. You talking about it.
Your cat's maybe salivating at Whisker's 100-gram pouches, but not 200-gram pouches.
Definitely not.
And so when people thought about this, they thought, well, no, I don't. I want to have the freedom and flexibility. It might be slightly cheaper, but I'm not that type of customer if I'm buying pouches. And so the one crucial data point, i.e. cats happen to cohabit more often than not, or at least 50% of the time, was a completely erroneous data point. And it, it did cost a lot of money and gave me, a bit of a headache. It was 6 months of my life that ended in nothing. But as my boss said, great learning. So no regrets, maybe.
So there we have it. Season 1 is a wrap. We'll be right back with Season 2 from 21st of June. And do we have a blockbuster of a guest for you? One of the world's leading public intellectuals and best-selling authors. A man so smart in his use of data, he'll have you listening to the episode again and again, sharing it with colleagues, clients, and collaborators. And the identity of that guest? You'll have to tune in again in a couple of weeks' time. But rest assured, Quincy the Office Cat has a major starring role in that episode too. Any suggestions for guests? If you think you'd make a good guest yourself, or or work with someone who'd tell a great story about how they make smarter use of data, well, just drop us an email at hello@usingdatasmarter.com. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.